Okay, so first things first, welcome, thank you. I said we had Wesley Lowery with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. One of the things that made you very famous around the world was that during the Ferguson protests, you were arrested as a journalist while doing your job. I think that's a good place to start with. I guess what was that like, being arrested during the protests?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Great to see everybody and get to travel around. It's been a whirlwind of a week here in England, but it's been a lot of fun. And when I think back to that, back in August 2014, I was a 24-year-old reporter at the Washington Post. I primarily covered politics, national politics, Congress, but had always made it part of my job to write about issues of race and justice when they intersected with national politics. And so when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, I raised my hand and got sent thinking I'd go for about 3 days and ended up staying there for about 3 months. 2 or 3 days in, myself and another reporter, Ryan Riley, were arrested. Now, anytime there are massive protests, there are going to be significant numbers of arrests. And anytime there's significant numbers of arrests and something like that, you end up seeing members of the media who get sucked into that as well. And so in a lot of ways, what happened to Ryan and I was not particularly unique, other than the fact that we were, to our knowledge, the first reporters who were arrested in Ferguson. So in the days to follow, there were dozens more and tons of other people who were taken into police custody while covering what was going on. I think about two things. The first is that, obviously it's very frustrating to be out attempting to document something that's happening and to find yourself wrapped up and caught up in what's going on. Even at the most fundamental level, it's remarkably frustrating to be out on an assignment and not be able to complete the assignment you were working on, right? But secondarily, there's, I think that anytime we're talking about journalists being arrested or crackdown on First Amendment activity when it comes to mass protest, we have to remember that journalists aren't protected by some type of special First Amendment, where that thing that enables us to be there in the streets documenting what's going on is the same set of rights that ensure that the demonstrators and protesters themselves are allowed to petition their government. And so you might have a night where 2 journalists are arrested and 200 citizens are arrested, and all the scrutiny falls on the arrest of those journalists, right? Was this arbitrary? Was this fair? Was this an infringement upon their right? And what I would suggest is that we flip that and invert it, and we think about, well, if the police are willing to infringe upon the rights of the media, to what extent are they even further potentially infringing upon the rights of those who are petitioning their government by being in the streets and protesting and demonstrating in the first place, right? And so while we knew our arrest was kind of silly and needless, we also, as members of the media, knew that we had a profession that was likely to rally around us. We knew that we had backing from our newsroom and our bosses and legal avenues that the average person who was taken into custody during this protest was very unlikely to have. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about and to remember when we think about these incidents of mass arrest and protest as we start talking about press rights.
Yeah, that's interesting because you're still a black man in America, right? Which
Sure.
a lot of these protests were around. So in your first book, you really did cover BLM and you talked a lot about Ferguson. Can you give us an idea what was it like on the ground?
Sure. I think that when we think about what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and then later on in cities across the United States and frankly in cities across the country, what we saw were people who had decided that enough had been enough and that they were going to petition their government in what I think in a lot of ways is among the most pure forms, that they're going to step and put their physical bodies on the line into the streets and to demand something be different and demand a change. I don't think there's any coincidence that this occurred during the second term of the first black president, that you had many young people and many people across age groups who had been extremely moved by the Obama candidacy, who had entered and come into electoral politics through his campaign and his campaigns, and yet saw each day the limitations of representational politics in a black presidency. That under a black presidency, Trayvon Martin had been killed. That under a black presidency, Michael Brown had been killed, or Sandra Bland, or Philando Castile, right? Freddie Gray. And that it allowed these people to see clearly that they wanted more than what they had been receiving. And that what they had been able to achieve through electoral politics still was not a world of justice and equality and equity that they desired. And so it's unsurprising to me, I think it's no coincidence that we see this eruption of grassroots political activism driven by young black people during a black presidency. In fact, I think that the black presidency itself accelerates this political movement. It was remarkable, though. I think that, I ended up spending dozens, if not hundreds of nights in the streets covering protest and demonstration in American cities. And I think that so often what I felt like I was experiencing or witnessing was a question of legitimacy or a lack of legitimacy. That when you step out into the street in front of a line of police officers and yell at them and scream at them, disobey them, perhaps throw something at them, right? It's an exercise and expression of illegitimacy, that you are not acknowledging their governmental legitimacy. And so it was unsurprising to me. And so it was unsurprising to me that there were black Americans in so many different parts of the country who were willing and who were eager to express that level of frustration, that this became an outlet to air decades of accumulated grievance and to make clear for the record the unfinished work of building a multiracial democracy.
That's interesting about the Obama point, because in some ways, Obama is supposed to represent the post-racial moment, right? Things are different. America's 69% of African Americans at the time thought this was the fulfillment of Martin Luther King's dream. So you're kind of saying there's actually a backlash against Obama, not against, maybe not against, but there's a backlash to Obama from black people, which causes this kind of eruption of protest.
Certainly. I mean, I think it's an acknowledgement of the limitations of a black presidency, right? It is true that there is this belief across the political spectrum that perhaps the election of a black president signals the beginning of a post-racial America. But then I think the years that follow make it very clear that is not the case. Very obviously not the case, right? Beyond that, though, I mean, secondarily, on the question of King's dream, I think you could cut that in one of two different directions. The first is that in so much as the major victory of the Civil Rights era was the Voting Rights Act and the creation of a multiracial democracy as opposed to an apartheid state, then it is true that the greatest possible achievement that could come from that would be the election of a black man to become the President of the United States, right? That in many ways, Barack Obama is among the greatest potential achievements that can be won based on the tools achieved by the Civil Rights Movement, right? On the other hand, right, if what King argues for in not just his dream speech during the March on Washington, but across his body of work, is a world where there is an equality of experience, of opportunity, right, where not interpersonal judgment by the content and character, but rather that the society sees his black daughter, his black son, as fully equal and deserving in the way that a white person or a white daughter or son would be, right? It is clear that Barack Obama is elected at a time of deep racial inequality in the United States of America, right? A time that consists and persists today, and so I think that there is and so I think that we can hold both of those truths at once, right? I think that one of the things I try to think about is how do we think about the election of Barack Obama not necessarily as the beginning of some new era of history, but rather as a continuation of an era we were already living
Yeah.
in which, armed with voting rights in multiracial democracy, Black Americans and their allies had the ability to elect Black faces to high places, right? Something that's now been true for much of, for all of my lifetime at least. Yet that still has a remarkable limitation in terms of its abilities to actually upend the inequalities in our society.
Yeah. But it's interesting because we'll get to the American Whitelash. One of the theses is that there's a backlash to the Obama presidency, right? There's a backlash to the idea. White people start to think that they're losing. But what it sounds like you're saying is, well, actually, not really much change for Black people. Actually, Obama's presidency had so many limitations. Did anything actually improve? Did anything fundamentally shift for there to be a backlash again?
I think that I'm of two minds on this, right? That the election of Barack Obama is both an achievement in and of itself, and also is not an achievement in and of itself, right? In a country that is founded on an explicitly white supremacist caste system, in which Black Americans had to labor and fight for decades on centuries, one, for the acknowledgement of their very humanity, secondarily for the acknowledgement of their franchisement and their citizenry. It would be naive or I think foolish to suggest the ascension of a Black man to the presidency is an inconsequential historical point, right? However, right, what is also true is that having a Black face or Black person be the spokesperson for the American Empire does not actually change the underlying realities of the American Empire, right? And I think we see this across groups. We see this debate playing out in the States right now about many of the aging elected officials, specifically many of whom are people of color or who are women, who were elected at a time when their very presence was seen as a radical act. But now what do you do if their politics are not of the moment, and now maybe they are arguably the people who are standing in the way of a level of progress, right? We've seen this play out most famously with the refusal of former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to retire. Now she's a historic figure. Her very presence on the court as an outspoken feminist was extremely important to the arc of history. And what is also true is her decision to stay in that position resulted in a much different construction of the court and aided in the fall of Roe v. Wade and arguably the first major setback of women's rights in the United States of America in a generation, right? And so the simple representation may or may not be, at this moment in our politics, may or may not be the most prudent step forward, right? But you also can understand why, if you come of age at a time when people like you have been systemically excluded from rooms and from tables, why you would continue to fight and cling to your inclusion in those places, why that would be of a foundational importance to you, right? However, what we're seeing in this moment are generations of young people, not just in the States, but across the world, who have seen themselves represented at the highest levels of government and have seen inequalities persist despite that representation. So representation in and of itself is no longer the goal or the aim. And in fact, I think there's an increasing understanding of the ways that there are times where, there's the old phrase, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, right? The idea that simply having a Black representation or LGBTQ representation or a female representation may not in and of itself be a pathway towards liberation. And so I think it's been interesting. I think that, on the other hand, though, what was unquestionably true, no matter what is true about the extent of progress represented by the election of a Black president, there was a subsection of white America that saw this as an emergency situation, as a sign that the country as they had it and they had known it was gone and had changed irreparably. They saw this as the ushering in of a new era and a new time. And they believed that this all pretended to a world in which they would lose the power and the station that they have held. And so what we see in response, not just to the Obama election, but also to the deep demographic change of our country, is an increasingly anxious, radicalized, reactionary movement that arises in our majority white population and becomes the most powerful force in our politics. And so when we see what happens in the decade following Obama, it's impossible to divorce that from this remarkably frantic and flailing event that is the introduction of a black presidency to a country that up until that moment, where white Americans had believed, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly, that they still sat atop the racial caste system.
Do you think President Trump happens if you don't have President Obama?
I mean, I think it's an interesting counterfactual. I think that much of what Donald Trump runs on and is elected on and vows to do, much of where he continues to draw his support, exists separate of Barack Obama, the politician, right? The demographic change of the country was happening. The technological advances that upended our economy and the function were happening. There were black advances across culture that were true even if those advances had not been reflected in a politics, right? That in many ways it was a matter of time before there would be a black president, whether or not that was going to be Barack Obama or someone else.
Not Jesse Jackson.
Sure. But what would have been interesting is had Jesse been successful in 88 or 92, I imagine we very likely may have seen a figure like Donald Trump arise in the 90s, right? And so I think that there is it's impossible to unweave these two strands that are now so braided together, but what is true is that it's not necessarily a one-for-one in that what Donald Trump rode to political power was a political movement, a social movement that spoke to the time and spoke to not a majority of Americans, but a significant portion of Americans, and certainly a significant portion of white Americans. His political coalition is almost exclusively white. And it's statistically exclusively white. Right? It's the margin of error, right? In so much as there are non-white people who are a member of Trump's coalition. And so those frustrations, those anxieties were certainly set off by a black presidency, but they were equally set off by a rising protest movement like Black Lives Matter, by changes in our culture and our society, by technological advancements, by advancements in the LGBTQ movements, right? That all of this creates and primes the nation for this type of reactionary moment. Mm-hmm. And here, into that void, steps someone like Donald Trump, who is willing to embrace such a reactionary politics.
Yeah. I want to come back to that in a second, but I actually want to go back to something you said about representation, because it's interesting. In the UK, we have the most diverse government we've ever had. It's also the most racist government.
I was about to say, how's that serving you guys?
It's not doing very well. It's not doing very well at all. And I think I've been listening to a lot of stuff about Clarence Thomas. Mm-hmm. And Clarence Thomas, if you don't know, is a Supreme Court justice, the most racist, the most right-wing of all the Supreme Court justices. And he's also black, right? The only black Supreme Court justice. And not only that, he actually replaces Thurgood Marshall, who's like a civil rights hero on the court. And so it's making me think, we say it's a whitelash, but it seems there's a lot of black and brown people involved in the whitelash.
Oh, certainly. Well, but when we think about it, and we ground our conversation, and you and I know this, right, and our audience knows this, right, that race is not a biological reality, right? The whiteness, when we talk about whiteness, we're not actually talking about literally a race of biologically white people, right? We're talking about the social, societal construct of whiteness, right? And what is to be white if it is to not be black, right? That at its core, whiteness is defined against what it is in its opposition to. And we see in the United States of America, we see this development, this codification in our laws, in our documents, as a means of dividing what were indentured servants in the early colonies of both black and white ancestry, African and European ancestry, and the creation of this racial classification system, in part so that these kind of feudal lords could more easily prevent uprisings, right? That in many ways race is invented as a means of justifying other inequalities in our country. And we weren't even a country yet. So what we see is that people of any race can, one, aspire to whiteness. Two, whiteness is a moving, expanding category, that we have sets of people in the United States of America, whether they be Italians or Irish, who are today considered societally white, who at various points in our history would not have been considered societally white, and in fact would have been the ones experiencing one of the deadliest lynchings in the United States of America is in New Orleans against Italian Americans, right? And that there's a process by which, and we've seen Irish American, Italian American writers write about this, a process by which immigrant groups can become white in America. They can assimilate themselves into our white dominant society, into a white supremacist system, by defining themselves against blackness, right? We see this now increasingly. This is one of the ironies of this conversation, that much of the anxiety in our country is currently based around demographic change being driven by Hispanic American immigration, even as many of the Hispanic Americans immigrating self-identify as white and are assimilating into American whiteness, right? That there's actually, I think it's a poor assumption to assume that as the demographics continue to change, that the Hispanic Americans who are entering the country are going to somehow assimilate themselves into a multicultural coalition, as opposed to assimilating themselves as the Irish did, or as the Italians did, into American whiteness in this way, right? And so but I think those distinctions are important, right? Because I think that there's a rhetorical and narrative debate right now where, and there's actually some brilliance to this, where people who oppose multiracial democracy would argue that by talking honestly about our history, by talking about the ideas of whiteness as a construct, right, that we're actually being racially essentialist in some way. That we're arguing that that someone is arguing that because you are societally coded as white, you will therefore have these immutable characteristics, right? And actually, what I would note is the properly understood, I think the anti-racist argument is the exact opposite of that. It's an argument that race is not a biological reality, that rather it's a societally constructed reality, right? And that by understanding it, that is how we can undermine it and deconstruct it, right? But we can't do that if we're unwilling to understand it, if we're unwilling to interrogate the ways that this societal construction impacts our life, right? How race is lived in reality. And that, in fact, this is something that we are collectively capable of undoing, but in order to do that, we have to be willing to look at it.
Why is there so much ignorance of whiteness? Because, like, for example, that issue of America is going to be majority, minority, entirely depends on lots of white people from Latin America decided they're not white. Which is like, I really think it's not going to happen, right? I mean, most immigrants from Latin America identify as white. You can already see historically with Mexican communities, you've seen this white. You've seen it historically, the idea that, you know, immigrant groups come in the country and they tend to go, if they can go to whiteness, they tend to go to whiteness because it's white supremacy. Mm-hmm. Actually, in the UK, it's very similar. So in the UK, we just had Brexit, right? We just left the European Union because people were terrified of immigrants. If we just remembered they were white, then probably would have been fine. But we'd still be in the EU. Right? So I guess why? Why is there so much, just a complete inability to look at history and to kind of accept what whiteness is in a sense?
Well, I think you nailed it when you talk about, I think there's a general collective ignorance about our history. And that ignorance is not happenstance, it's ignorance that has been constructed, right? That so often we, the collective we, society, both in the States and internationally, don't tell ourselves the truth about what's happened previously. And so because of that, we don't come to these conversations or to these moments equipped to understand that the moment in which we find ourselves is a moment that we have found ourselves in before, in which smart people have grappled with these questions and had these conversations, that there's a presentism, that everything happening now is different, and in reality, what we're seeing and what we're grappling with in countries across the world is this debate of like us versus them and how many other people do we let in, right? At its core is a huge part of what is happening, and with the globalization and with technology, people can feel this anxiety about a mysterious other people, even though they still live in a town with no one unlike them, far removed from any immigrants or any people who are different, but they're convinced because Beyonce's playing the Super Bowl that like the world has been taken over. And so there's this remarkable, but again, I think that there's an ignorance, and but there's also something very human about that anxiety. Right, and I want to be earnest for a second about that. Right, where we are as humans self-interested and selfish. I don't even mean that in a negative way. Right, that we do at a time where things are uncertain or unclear, where times are tumultuous. Which, by the way, is all times. There's not a year we could go back to where everything was great back then. Right, but we worry about ourselves, about our loved ones, about our community, about what's going to happen. Are we going to be the winners or losers of history, right? And we act in ways when we are scared and confused that to do the best to try to self-preserve ourselves, right? Which can be as simple as, no, build a wall and don't let anyone else in. Because I know how much food we have, and I don't know how much we'll have tomorrow if we right? And I think that gets back to why it's so important for us to understand the anxiety that is being experienced by these white majority countries and these white majority populations, where for them, if the world has been constructed in their favor, 5% of equalizing feels to them like a 5% loss, right? And so suddenly you've created a space where you have people, despite the fact that this entire system is structured and constructed to their favor, it still feels as if. Right, and we see this in other contexts, right? It's the guys who get together and go, I guess we can't make that joke anymore, X, Y, and Z, because it's about women. And it's this reality. It's a feeling of loss, a feeling of a freedom that was once had, even though that freedom came at the expense of someone else. And I don't think we can paper over. Not that I think these are like the victims of the story, right? But we can't paper over the reality of the anxiety that comes with that feeling of loss, and how that results in a thrashing and a lashing out.
It reminds me of a Chris Rock joke where he said, white people run around saying, we're losing the country, but if you're losing, who's winning? It's not us, right?
Well, of course. Well, there's a line in the book where I talk about, right, so much of white supremacist ideology is based on this conspiracy theory that there's a white genocide happening, right? That the Jews have masterminded this plan to use the refugees and the immigrants and the black people to destroy the white race. And it's really remarkable because this plan has been going on for centuries, and yet there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions more white people than there are anyone else, right? This is a remarkably inefficient genocide that's been taking place supposedly for hundreds of years by the people who also supposedly control all of the institutions and have all of the money and all of the power, right? That it's actually like a remarkably poorly executed scheme if it is actually happening, and it obviously is not, right? But I think that it speaks to and exposes the lie. But beyond that, though, you think about why conspiracy and conspiracy theory attracts us, and there's something seductive about believing that I know something that no one else knows, that I see something that no one else sees, that I'm suddenly hyper important, that I get it, and I'm trying to save everyone, and I need you all to listen, right? And you can see how someone or large groups of people get lost deeper and deeper in this, right? And by the very nature of such a conspiracy, efforts to disprove it only make the beliefs more fervent and zealous, right? Well, they don't want you to read this stuff, and they're taking it down off the internet, and they won't let you, right? It's the secret book that no one else has, and it's because nothing in the book is true, right? But so we see how over time, right, you have people who already are feeling this. They're feeling this deficit. They're anxious and they're scared. They're seeing the world around them change, and they have to decide. Am I just going to be the demographic loser of history, or am I going to be the brave person who stood up for, in the face of a threat that perhaps I've fabricated in my own head, right? But I think that interpersonal motivation helps us understand why I think these movements are so attractive to so many people.